Welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us for the Q&A of No Straight Lines. I would just like to reintroduce our guests, director-producer Vivian Kleiman, producer Justin Hall, editor Christiane Badgley, and artists Alison Bechdel, Rupert Kinnard, and Jennifer Camper. Thank you all so much for taking the time to talk with me today about this incredible film. It's really such a treat, especially to have the artists here with us, because this is a film that's about so much more than your wonderful artwork, but about what you as artists were able to accomplish in creating a space for yourselves, building this beautiful community, and encouraging really a variety of voices to flourish within it. So I want to begin, as these things usually begin, by asking about how the film came into being. I know it was an adaptation of sorts of your book, Justin, also called No Straight Lines. But while we have the stories of how the artists discovered comics, we don't have yours. So I want to ask the filmmakers specifically what your own experiences were in discovering queer comics and what they've meant to you in your lives.
Well, I definitely been immersed in queer comics for many, many years. I'm a cartoonist myself, and so met all these artists through the trials and tribulations of working conventions together and doing various panels and over the years. And then it was also sort of passion project of mine to get these voices out into the world. So curated a museum show of the work, and then eventually a book on the history of queer comics, and then was able to collaborate with Vivian. Vivian came on with her incredible filmic expertise and creative vision, and we have this film, which I'm incredibly proud of being a part of.
And Vivian?
Yeah, for me, actually, my exposure to queer comics started when I was a young dyke, and I would follow the drawings and wonderful stories that Alison Bechdel would offer us, and we would all run to get Plexus, the local queer paper, women's paper, and see what happened to our favorite people in dykes to watch out for, the characters that Alison was drawing. And then fast forward many years, and Justin approached me with an idea for doing a film on queer comics. And I wasn't quite sure in the beginning because I'm not immersed in that world. I attended the first ingathering of Queers in Comics that Justin and Jen Camper created. It was absolutely amazing New York City experience. And Rupert was there too, and Alison came. It was, as I like to say, it was a casting director's dream, because the range of artists who attended, the ages, the kinds of folks, from button-down GQ guy to people with bright chartreuse green hair, and everyone feeling connected and talking with one another and slapping zines in each other's hands and buttons and pins, and it was just a delightful experience. It was a very affirming experience. And I went, aha, this is a great way to tell our history to a new generation. And not just to tell our history, but to explore the notion of what it means to represent oneself through art, and through this art in particular.
And Christiane, do you have any associations with queer comics before this film?
Well, I happen to be the editor and someone who actually doesn't really read comics. And when Vivian first told me about the project, I thought it sounded incredible and fun, and I knew it would be great. But at that time, I was just hearing about it as a project. I wasn't talking to her about editing. But when I came on to do some consulting, and then later she asked me if I would consider coming back to do editing. And I was like, well, I'd love to, but I'm not a comics person, but I have to say, just diving in, it was just so amazing, because the art was wonderful, the artists, the stories, I just had a blast. So I got a quick education in comics / queer comics, but mainly it was just this joyful, dive into this wonderful art form. And I have to say, now I am motivated to get out and actually buy and read comics.
I just want to kind of talk about the scene with Jennifer going to Coney Island and admiring the kind of painted text and graphics. This film really touches on the nature of influence and where we draw inspiration from. So I'd like to ask the artist now kind of what the experience was like for you to see this next generation inspired by your work, but also at the same time to engage directly with your own mentors and influences. So Rupert, could we start with you?
Oh my goodness. um, well, I've been in the position somewhat recently to really kind of span my career and find myself in a place where I really have been examining some of my earlier influences. And one of the stories I think that's being told in the documentary, it has to do with the fact that I was influenced by cartoons and comics at a very early age. And so I just ended up being able, learning to draw a lot of the superheroes of the day, Superman, Batman, Green Lantern. And I became very influenced by the style of those cartoonists. And even as a young person, I think I was really taken by how I was able to kind of distinguish the style of a certain artist. And then I became introduced to the whole idea of artists being assisted by inkers. And so the idea that one artist would draw and then another artist would ink their work, I became, really enamored of that whole process. So in the beginning, in terms of just creativity in my art, I was influenced by illustrators or cartoonists like Jack Kirby, John Buscema, John Romita, those types of people that I'm not sure how familiar people are. But I also became very influenced creating my own comic characters at one point with with Muhammad Ali and with James Baldwin. So it was really my being influenced by those media figures or those cultural figures that.
Sorry, we were just cutting out a little bit there. Yeah, that's wonderful
Okay,
that you have those stories in the film that are kind of non-comic influences as well. And I mean, I guess this is similar to Jennifer's experience in Coney Island, but also just kind of like, Jennifer, if we could throw it to you and kind of just talk about what it's like having your mentors and your personal influences, but also this next generation of artists that you're inspiring at the same time, kind of engaging on those different levels.
Yeah, that's something I've always been interested in, and it's how we both are influenced by other people and then we influence the people coming after us. And when you are not seeing your own stories told in an art form like comics, we're desperately trying to see ourselves, and we're creating subtext where there's no subtext just to find some dyke in a cartoon. And and then when you first find a cartoon or a comic strip that has a story that relates to your own life, it's so exciting. And I think we really cherish those comics that came, before we started making our own comics. The few cartoons we could read that had queer content became, spectacularly dear to us. And then for all of us, we don't realize who we're influencing beyond us. So it's this incredible chain. And all the comics events I put together, I really strive to have those generations talk to each other and influence each other and inspire each other. And I just love to have a party with queer cartoonists. So
yeah, absolutely. That's what this film feels like, really. So Alison, I think your story is a little special as well, because it seems like you have a kind of mentorship relationship with Howard Cruz in the film. Could you talk about kind of influence and the different generations, and maybe if mentorship comes into that for you?
Yeah, I feel so lucky because the moment I graduated from college in 1981, I wandered into a gay bookstore in New York City, and there right on the newsstand was a copy of Gay Comics #1, which Howard had just edited and which had work by Jen in it. And it was like, like the trumpets were blaring, like, this is what I could do. I'd always drawn casually and thought it would be fun to be a cartoonist, and I had just come out as a lesbian. So all of a sudden these two like things in my life, my love of comics and my queerness, converged in that comic book. And I saw that this was something I could do. I could write comics about my particular life. And that's what I set about doing. I didn't actually meet Howard until several years after that. But when I did, he was a very kind and generous mentor in many ways.
Yeah, he really is a wonderful character in this film, and it's so sweet, this dedication you have at the end to him. We are missing kind of some of the titans in this Zoom meeting here, but how did these artists kind of come together for you, Vivian? How did you select the artists, and as well, how did you select the next generation?
Complicated questions. First of all, I knew that I did not want to do a survey. I knew that I wanted to be more focused. I know that often filmmakers like to choose one person to profile, but in this case, one person's experience would not represent the diversity of voices. Justin and I actually knew that there were certain people who definitely were going to be in the film for various reasons. Rupert and I have known each other for decades, so he was one of my fave picks. And then once the film was assembled, we had the initial footage and the initial assembly, I looked at it and I thought, these are really great people that we chose, really great stories, like really great stories, a plethora of visuals. A filmmaker couldn't ask for, a better subject. But there was something missing. It felt kind of old in a way. It felt kind of just like looking at the past, even though folks were giving a nod to the future and to other generations. So I was trying to think of some way to infuse it with more vitality, with more of a life force. And I also wanted to make sure that the welcome mat was out for a younger viewer. I was very committed to having this be a story told in the vernacular of young people, comics, and encouraging them. So I did an experiment one day. That same said Queers and Comics conference traveled from New York 2 years later to San Francisco. And there was, Justin helped select about a dozen young people. We threw them in front of the camera. I didn't know who they were. I had never seen their artwork. It was a complete experiment. Thank goodness we were self-funded, because the funder might have had a fit if it didn't work. I had an assistant with watching for 10 minutes per person. I had 10 minutes to interview everybody and try to get something meaningful. And thus began an experiment which divided the viewer. I showed that I included some of those interviews in the cut. I tried playing with them in different spots. This is before Christiane Badgley came on board. And the response was divided. People who were over the age of 50, 55, many of them questioned it, going, what the heck is that? Like, if you're going to include these people, then I want to know all about them. Tell me about their stories. What are they doing? Who are they? Where do they come from? Where do they want to go? And people under the age of 40 said, why are you asking me the question? What is the question? Like, what? So I knew at that point that I was onto something good. From there, it became a question of how to work out the relationships, how to tell the story. I would pass the baton to Badge to talk about the effort made to try to find a narrative structure that would braid these different elements into one cohesive narrative.
Well, I mean, of course, we felt that the main driver of the story of the film was the stories of the protagonists, and then interspersed with that were some moments in queer history and comics history in general. But as far as the younger people were concerned, it did seem like it made sense to kind of create something specific to those young people. So this next gen idea, we developed that. And the more we focused on that and making that a discrete kind of segue sort of unit throughout the film, it just started working, and then we played with a different material that could fit into those next gen sequences. Sometimes they were a little thematic, sometimes they were connecting to something we had just seen or we were just going to see. Anyway, we played with that, and it ended up working quite nicely, because one, it's fun and interesting, but also it was a nice way to kind of work with the rhythm of the film, and also helping us kind of move from person to person, subject to subject, because the structure of the film ended up being fairly complex. And that was one of the nice little elements that kind of brought everything together.
Yeah, you mentioned, oh, sorry, Justin, do you have something to add?
I was just going to say that there's an emotional connection that I think, that Vivian was really going for, and really was excited to see kind of land filmically, that, Jen, when she created Queers in Comics Conference, was really pushing for this as well, this sort of connection between generations. And we oftentimes, as queer people, don't have a sense of our own history because it's not passed on through family. And then also cartoonists tend to not have a sense of history of the art form because it's so new to sort of the academic world and being treated with any sort of respect. So, there's a clip in the film where Lawrence Lindell, who's a former student of mine, is discovering Rupert's work and realizing that there were queer Black comics representations back in the 1970s, and how profound that was to him. And I remember, like, when Jen and I put together this panel at Queers in Comics, putting Lawrence on a panel with Rupert and seeing this sort of remarkable emotional synergy of these two generations being able to talk to each other about how to create representation and how to kind of put creativity out in the world, and to see some of that emotional resonance then show up on screen was like, oh, just magical.
Yeah, and I think Christiane mentioned as well that there are these kind of important moments in contemporary queer history that are covered as well. It really seems to cover kind of a really broad arc of contemporary queer history. And I just was curious as I was watching the film as to whether that was kind of pulled from the art itself, or whether you were able to kind of go back and find the kind of art that informed that period.
Actually, the moments in our history that were to be included in the film was something that Justin and I had structured early on. It was in every proposal. So instead of Act 1, Act 2, it was Decade X and Decade Y. But the notion of how to tell that story and how to represent that story actually emerged through the process of editing. I looked at the material. I was showing the material once in a while to fresh eyes to get feedback. And I would be surprised when somebody would say, oh, that's kind of boring, when it was so dynamic to me. And I realized, oh yeah, it's the same old footage. They've seen the same footage. They've seen the same photos. Yes, this is framed differently, but what could I do that would infuse it with more of a life force? And that's when I started to take a nosedive and reach for comics with content that where the subject of the comics was the history, the historic moments. So for example, with HIV and AIDS or Stonewall. It infused the piece with more, it becomes more, it integrated the historical elements with the artistic expression.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's also kind of echoed in the visual style, which it is really dynamic and really kind of special in the way that you have these comic elements that are bleeding their way into the live elements, and kind of at the same time, the way the comics are kind of retained in the way that you would read them as a comic book. I really appreciated that. How did you conceive of that visual style, and how did it come together throughout the filmmaking process?
I would say the emphasis is on the word process. The whole notion, all these different visual elements were an accrual of different ideas, and a wonderful collaborative process with motion graphics people and young people, involved in the process itself. For example, one opening that I thought was just spectacular, a young next gen person on who became our associate producer, Cassandra, showed it to her buddies and they gave it total thumbs down. They said it was completely boring, and I was horrified, crestfallen. It took a while to pick myself up again, but you just keep going and try to find another door, another access. And it was truly an accrual. Suzanne Slatcher, our amazing animator, and really raised the visual language to a whole new level. And it was a really great collaboration of a lot of creative people.
It's certainly not boring. Go ahead.
No, I think there's also just a sort of reverence of the form, right? That we want to pay respect to the form of comics and not turn it into animation, as you sort of mentioned before, or presented as in a way that feels respectful to the form itself, and to the artists who created that work.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'd like to go back to the artists now. There's another scene, Alison, where you're looking at an early panel. You knew the exact pen you used. You commented on the paper quality. And this is kind of a question for all of the artists. What was the experience like for you in revisiting your past work? And did you speak with Vivian much about which pieces to include? Was there a lot of digging? So Rupert, if we could start with you again.
I really did use the opportunity to learn from the interviews that happened when Vivian and Justin came to Portland. It really did kind of force me to look at my journey as a cartoonist in a whole different way. And one of the things I did realize was the degree to which all of these scattered elements came together to create what ended up being cathartic comics. The fact that I was enamored of superheroes, and I became really involved with comic strips like Doonesbury. When I ended up going to college in 1976, I was invited to draw an editorial cartoon for the editorial page of the school newspaper every week. And that forced me to think in terms of the characters that I created in a more political way. I used the opportunity to really discuss and explore what was going on campus. So the whole idea of being able to almost be forced into looking at the totality of your career and question yourself about how did I get here was a really big revelation for me.
Jennifer?
Well, looking at my old work is sort of twofold. One is the snapshot in time. Like you were saying before, you remember exactly when you drew it, how you drew it, what you were listening to while you drew it, what was going on outside the window. And then there's also that peculiar experience of finding work that you have no memory of doing. And then you get that sort of out of body experience of looking at work, with these incredibly fresh eyes and seeing yourself as your younger self as this totally other person. And you can't even draw or write like that anymore. So that's kind of cool. But also doing this film allowed me to just, express my profound love and excitement for all the other cartoonists and their work. And, we are a bit of a family and community because we are so marginalized, especially at the beginning. And so we desperately sought each other out and we hungrily devoured each other's work. And so this film just sort of lets us all geek out about how much that excites us.
Alison?
Following up on what Jen just said, I remember being at some writers conferences back in the 90s, Jen, with you and Howard, and some other cartoonists. Now I can't remember everyone, but we were talking at the time about how all the writers were kind of backbiting and envious of one another and gossiping, and the cartoonists were all just happily hanging out together because we didn't have the same material anxieties that the writers didn't. No one was giving us any big contracts. You know, we had nothing to fight about. It's been so long since the crew came to my house to film me and look at my stuff. I can't really even remember. I feel like, Vivian, you might have had some ideas of what you wanted to see, but I feel like mostly I just like started digging through my files and throwing stuff all over the room. I can't figure out how you got anything out of that.
I wanted to come in with a plan, to be honest. I had looked through oodles of dikes to watch out for to try to pick out a few for you to focus on. And I just simply couldn't make a decision. So I threw my hands up and I threw it in your lap.
I think we went through my childhood drawings. Like I had a whole box of stuff from when I was a little kid. Yeah, it took me weeks to put my office back together after you visited.
Well, thank you all so much for bringing into the world your art and your insight and for creating such a vibrant and beautiful space. And thank you to the filmmakers for this wonderful film. I know that I came out with a reading list and I hope that our audience does too. So thank you everyone for being here today. Please visit our website at docs.afi.com for more opportunities to interact with these films and audiences and filmmakers, and of course to watch more films. So if you love this one like we do, please tell your friends. It's available to screen throughout the remainder of the festival. We would love to hear from you on social media at #AFIDocs. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.